Mergers and acquisitions sure enjoyed a healthy fourth quarter after virtually a dead first half of 2009. Total value of M&A transactions surged 52% to $530 billion in Q4. You can thank big deals like ExxonMobil's purchase of XTO Energy and Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway scooping up Burlington Northern Santa Fe, as you know. But deal makers and advisors say it could be years until M&A returns to record levels last seen in 2007. Joining us now to talk about the industry, Gary Horowitz, partner at Simpson Thacher and Bartlett. Gary, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so characterize the activity. What are you working on these days?
Well, that's a good question. As you said, there has been a little bit of a pop in activity, both in the strategic merger area and in the private equity area.
Okay, so for our viewers, separate strategic merger versus PE. What's the difference?
Strategic mergers when two existing companies merge. Private equity means a financial sponsor is interested in buying an operating company.
Okay, so who's in the best shape? Who's poised to benefit the most? I've heard a lot of people talk about the powder kegs really geared up for the private equity industry with credit flowing again.
Well, that's true. As you've seen in the last quarter, there have been a number of private equity deals, and we saw very little activity before that, and that's because credit has loosened up somewhat. Many of the deals are in the $1.5 to $2.5 billion range, but in fact, we saw a large deal. TPG is acquiring IMS for something near $5 billion.
And how much, in terms of the, the companies buying each other, like, is cash a story here? Because a lot of these companies, are being able to use a lot of cash.
Well, that is part of the story, but in some cases people are using stock as well, and in part that goes to the fact that volatility in stock prices has calmed down a little bit since the first half of the year.
All right, Gary, while I ask my next question, if you could just tweak your mic, it's just hitting your shirt a little bit there. I want to ask you about the regulation coming out of Washington and how, if at all, that's impacted your line of work advising these M&As. There's a lot of talk, as you know, out of Washington, working, I guess they have a House bill. It's got to get through the Senate still. So how are you gearing up to prepare for these changes?
Well, it's a little uncertain how those changes are going to affect the M&A business. As you know, the first half of the year was impacted very much by the financial crisis, and much of the M&A activity, although more limited than in the past, was in the financial services sector. We will see probably some less of that, and people are wondering, I think as you are, whether healthcare will be a very active area. As you know, pharmaceuticals this year have been very busy. There was the Wyeth-Pfizer deal, for example, and a number of other large deals and smaller deals as well, and we expect to see more of that.
In other words, more deals in the pharmaceutical sectors directly related to healthcare reform. That's interesting. So even though these companies are, the drug companies are going to have more subscribers, more people buying pills, they're still going to want to partner up?
Yes, I believe that's the case. I think it's difficult to continue a drug pipeline without making acquisitions.
Any problems with antitrust issues? I know that's probably a big area that you cover. You're always like having to check the boxes, right?
Yes. Sometimes it's more than checking the box. It's a little hard to tell. It's still a little early in this administration to tell how antitrust will play out. Okay,
so what what industries do you think are more susceptible to having antitrust questions?
Well, it's areas where where you already find concentration. That's where you'd look most, because the antitrust laws are there to protect against too much concentration, which could be to the detriment of consumers.
Can you talk about price at all in terms of like earnings multiples? I know that Bloomberg put out a story that was basically about a 25.5 times earnings price premium over the last 4 years. That was the average. The first half of last year was virtually dead for deals, but it really came into action in the fourth quarter in particular. So that brought that earnings or that multiple up.
Yes.
What can you anticipate here going forward?
Well, it's the last quarter or so is a little misleading in the sense that if stock prices are low, multiples will look higher. And so it's a little hard to look at, say, the last quarter, the last 2 quarters, the last 3 quarters as indicative of where premiums are going to go. But you're right, there have been some healthy premiums paid in recent transactions.
And is that something that you're keeping an eye on, or how do you advise companies on that front in terms of maybe they want a little more for their bang for their buck?
Well, I think people need to be realistic as well, and generally a target company isn't going to be all that keen on selling itself if, in fact, it is trading at less than, say, its 52-week high. And so that's something to keep in mind. Otherwise, it's really a question of how much negotiating power each side has.
Can I ask you about some of the big deals
Sure.
in the works that we're keeping an eye on? Obviously, Cadbury.
Yes.
How's that one going to wrap up?
It's anybody's guess.
Your eyes just lit up.
I know.
So
well, because it's exciting. It's
right.
obviously very exciting. Who knows? I think it'll end up in a transaction one way or another, although the UK government is very concerned about who the buyer is. And what's interesting in that transaction and in a few others is protectionist sentiment. And there's been a revival of protectionist sentiment in some transactions in the last few months.
Okay, any other company-specific public companies to keep an eye on?
Nothing that comes to mind immediately.
Nothing that you can say publicly. We'll leave it there. We'll let you off the hook, Gary.
Okay, I appreciate that.
Gary Horowitz, thank you so much for coming in today.
It was a pleasure.
Great to meet you.
Same here.